I'm 34 years old and I spent a decade being my family's punching bag, while my older brother Ryan got treated like he walked on water. 10 years of being called the family disappointment at every Thanksgiving, every Christmas, every birthday gathering. And now they're blowing up my phone begging for help because apparently their perfect golden child screwed them over so badly they're about to lose everything. The irony is so thick I could choke on it. Let me back up because you need the full picture to understand why I'm not rushing to save them. I graduated college at 22 with a degree in software development. Nothing fancy, state school, decent grades. Ryan was 28 at the time and had just opened his third retail location selling outdoor equipment and sporting goods. My parents acted like he'd invented electricity. Meanwhile, I got a job at a mid-sized tech firm making okay money. Nothing spectacular, but I was paying my bills and building experience. That apparently made me the family failure. The comparison started immediately. Ryan would show up to family dinners talking about his expanding business, his new commercial lease, his plans to open more locations across the state. My father, Louis, would sit there nodding along like Ryan was delivering the Sermon on the Mount. My mother, Pauline, would practically glow with pride. Then they'd turn to me and ask how my little computer job was going, and I could hear the disappointment in their voices before I even answered. It got worse every single year. Ryan bought a house at 29, got married to Georgia at 30, had his first kid at 31. My parents threw him a massive wedding, paid for half of it, gave them a down payment on the house as a wedding gift. When I asked if they'd do something similar when I eventually got married, my mother actually laughed and said that was for children who earned it, who made something of themselves. I was 25 and apparently still hadn't proven I deserved their support. The holiday dinners became torture sessions. Thanksgiving 2018, I'm sitting there trying to enjoy my turkey when my father stands up to make a toast about how proud he is that at least one of his sons made something of himself. He's looking right at Ryan while he says it. Everyone raises their glasses. I just sat there. Nobody even noticed. Christmas 2019. Ryan's showing off photos of his fourth store location. My mother's passing them around the table, cooing over every detail. I mentioned that I got promoted to senior developer with a significant raise. My father barely looked up from Ryan's photos and said something about how nice it must be to sit in an office all day while real men build actual businesses. Ryan laughed. His wife, Georgia, sitting right next to me, leaned over and said just loud enough for me to hear that it was sad I had no ambition at all, that some people were just built different. I wanted to throw my wine in her face, but I just excused myself and left early. Every family gathering was the same. My nieces, Ryan's daughters, Angelica, and the younger one, started picking up on it too. Angelica was maybe 7 years old when she asked me why I was so poor compared to her daddy. Where the hell does a 7-year-old learn to ask something like that? From listening to her parents and grandparents. That's where. The real knife in the back came in early 2020, right before everything shut down. I'm 30 years old at this point. My parents had always told both Ryan and me that they had inheritance money set aside for us. Equal amounts. Money from my grandfather that they'd been investing. Nothing crazy, but a decent amount that would make a real difference someday. Then my mother calls me and tells me they've decided to give Ryan his inheritance early. He needs it for a major business expansion, 5 new locations across 3 states, and this is his chance to really make it big. They're giving him roughly $180,000. I asked when I'd get mine. My mother actually said I didn't deserve it like Ryan did, that he'd proven he could make use of money like that while I was just coasting through life with my little paycheck. She said maybe someday if I got serious about my career and showed some initiative, but for now, the money would do more good with their successful son. I hung up on her. Didn't talk to them for 3 months. When I finally showed up to a family event again, my father acted like nothing had happened. Ryan had the nerve to pull me aside and tell me not to be bitter, that maybe in my next life I wouldn't be such a loser. His exact words. He was grinning when he said it. Here's what my family didn't know, what they never bothered to ask about. I wasn't coasting. I'd been working my tail off for years. That senior developer position I mentioned, I'd leveraged it to move to a better company in 2020, then another one in 2021, then started doing high-level freelance consulting on the side in 2022. I learned every skill I could, networked with everyone who mattered in my field, built a reputation. By 2023, I was making more than Ryan and my father combined, but I never told them. Why would I? So they could figure out some new way to diminish it. I'd been planning this for years, if I'm being honest. Every insult, every dismissal, every family dinner where they made me feel like garbage, I remembered. I kept working harder, kept building my success, and I knew eventually the chance would come to show them exactly how wrong they were. Not for reconciliation, not for some heartwarming moment where they realize they love me after all, for revenge. Cold, calculated, satisfying revenge. The messages started about 2 weeks ago. First from my mother, short and cryptic, asking if we could talk about something important. I ignored it. Then my father, saying they needed to discuss a family matter. Ignored. Then Ryan himself, multiple messages saying we needed to talk urgently about the family situation. Still ignored. Then the desperation started showing. My mother calling me 6 times in one day. My father leaving voicemails about how I was still their son and family needed to stick together. Georgia, who'd called me a poor thing with no ambition, suddenly sending me messages through Instagram asking if I'd received their calls. Even my niece Angelica's account sent me a message, though I'm sure her parents told her what to write, something about how much she missed her uncle. Yesterday, my father left a voicemail that actually had him crying, said they were in serious trouble, that they might lose everything, that they needed to talk to me immediately, that they'd been wrong about me, that they were sorry, that they needed my help desperately. I haven't called back. I'm sitting here looking at my phone, watching the messages pile up, and I'm not doing anything. Because I've been waiting for this moment for 4 years. Really for 10 years if I'm counting all of it. Whatever happened to them? Whatever disaster befell my perfect golden child brother and the parents who worshipped him, it's finally my turn to watch them squirm. My best friend thinks I should at least find out what happened before deciding anything. Part of me wants to know too. But the bigger part of me, the part that sat through years of being called a failure and a disappointment and a loser, the part that watched them hand my inheritance to Ryan while telling me I didn't deserve it, that part wants to let them panic a little longer. I built my success specifically for this. Every promotion, every raise, every new client, I did it knowing that someday they'd realize how badly they'd misjudged me. And now that day is here, and they're falling apart, and I'm the only one who can help them, apparently. I'm going to find out what happened, but on my timeline, not theirs. They made me wait 10 years to be seen as anything other than a failure. They can wait a little longer to find out if I'm willing to save them. Update 1. Okay, so I finally called my father back 3 days after that crying voicemail. Not because I felt bad for him, let me be clear about that. I wanted to know exactly what kind of mess they'd gotten themselves into before I decided how to handle this. The comments on my last post telling me to find out the details first were right. I needed the full picture before I made my next move. My father picked up on the first ring. He started talking immediately, thanking me for calling back, saying they'd been so worried I wouldn't respond, going on about how much they needed to talk to me. I let him ramble for about 30 seconds before I cut him off and told him I wanted to know what happened and I wanted the truth, all of it, right now. There was this long pause and then he said they should do this in person, that it was too complicated to explain over the phone. I told him no, that he could explain it perfectly fine right now or I could hang up and block his number. He caved immediately, started talking so fast I could barely keep up. Ryan's business collapsed. Not just failed, collapsed. All 7 locations closed within the span of 3 months. The expansion they'd funded with my inheritance money, the 5 new stores across 3 states that were supposed to make him this retail mogul. Every single one of them crashed and burned. According to my father, Ryan had overextended himself massively, took out loans against the original stores to fund the new ones, signed personal guarantees on commercial leases he couldn't afford, made promises to suppliers he couldn't keep. But here's where it gets really good. My parents didn't just give Ryan my inheritance for the business. They also co-signed on 2 of his commercial leases and took out a second mortgage on their house to loan him an additional $90,000. They put their house up as collateral because they believed in him so much, because their golden child could do no wrong. Now all those loans are coming due and Ryan has nothing. The stores are closed, the inventory was liquidated for pennies on the dollar, and he's being sued by 3 different landlords for breaking lease agreements. The creditors are coming after everyone whose name is on anything, which means my parents are on the hook for over $200,000 in Ryan's debts on top of the second mortgage they took out. My father was still talking, explaining how they'd already drained their retirement accounts trying to keep Ryan's business afloat these past 6 months, how they'd been making minimum payments on everything, but now they couldn't even do that. The bank sent them a foreclosure notice last week. They have 90 days to come up with $47,000 or they lose the house they've lived in for 32 years. I asked him where Ryan was in all this. My father got quiet and then admitted Ryan and Georgia had already filed for bankruptcy last month. They're protected now, apparently. The creditors can't touch them personally anymore. But my parents can't file for bankruptcy because they have too many assets that would be seized, including the house. And they'd still end up homeless, but with destroyed credit. Let me repeat that because it's so beautiful I want to savor it. Ryan got my inheritance, used it to build a failed business empire, dragged my parents into his mess as co-signers and lenders, and then saved himself with bankruptcy while leaving them holding the entire bag. The golden child screwed them completely. I asked my father why they thought I would help after everything they'd done to me. He started doing this thing where he was acknowledging they'd treated me badly, but also making excuses. Said they'd been hard on me because they wanted to push me to be better, that they saw potential in me that I wasn't living up to, that they'd put so much support behind Ryan because they thought he was the sure bet, the safe investment, and they were wrong. He kept saying they were wrong, like that fixed anything. I asked about the inheritance money, specifically. My father actually tried to justify it by saying Ryan needed it more at the time, that I was doing fine with my job and didn't need that kind of cash injection, that if they'd known how things would turn out, they would have made different choices. Not an apology, just a statement that their calculations had been wrong. Then he pivoted to talking about how I'd become so successful, how they'd heard I was doing really well in my career. I asked him how he heard that since I'd never told them anything. Turns out Georgia's sister works at a company that hired me as a consultant last year, and she mentioned to Georgia how much they were paying me. Georgia told Ryan, Ryan told my parents. They'd known for over a year that I was making serious money and never said a word about it to me, never acknowledged it, never congratulated me. But now they knew, and now they needed that money. My father said they were proud of me, that they'd always been proud even if they didn't show it well. I told him that was garbage, and he knew it. He didn't argue, just kept pivoting back to their current crisis, asking if we could meet in person to discuss options, saying that family needed to help family in times of trouble. I told him I'd think about it and hung up. He called back immediately. I didn't answer. My mother called an hour later. She was crying before she even said hello, going on about how scared she was to lose their home, how this was where she raised her boys. How could I let them become homeless when I had the means to help? I asked her if she remembered telling me I didn't deserve my inheritance, like Ryan did. She got quiet. Then she said she'd been wrong, that she'd said cruel things she regretted, that she was sorry. I asked her if she was sorry for what she said or sorry that she needed my money now. She started crying harder and said both, that she was sorry for both, that she'd been a terrible mother and she knew it, but she was still my mother, and didn't that count for something? Here's the thing that these comments on my last post got right. I needed to let them say all of this out loud. I needed to hear them admit they were wrong, admit they'd treated me like garbage, admit they'd chosen Ryan over me at every turn. But hearing it didn't make me feel better, and it definitely didn't make me want to save them. My mother kept talking about the house, about their retirement being gone, about how they were in their early 60s and too old to rebuild from nothing. She mentioned that Ryan and Georgia were living with them now because they'd lost their house too, that everyone was crammed into their place and the tension was unbearable. That detail made me pause. I asked when Ryan lost his house. She said 3 months ago, right around when the business officially collapsed. The bank foreclosed because they'd taken out a home equity line of credit to keep the stores running. So Ryan, Georgia, and my 2 nieces were all living in my parents' house, the house that was about to be foreclosed on in 90 days. I asked where they planned to go when they lost the house. My mother said that's why they needed me, that I was their only option. Not just for money to save the house, but if they couldn't save it, they needed somewhere to stay. She actually suggested I could help them find a place, maybe use my income to co-sign on a rental for them, since their credit was destroyed. The audacity of it was almost impressive. 10 years of insults, giving away my inheritance, watching them worship Ryan while treating me like a disappointment. And now they wanted me to not only give them money, but potentially sign my name to their housing situation. I told my mother I needed time to process all of this and I'd be in touch when I was ready. She begged me not to wait too long, that the foreclosure clock was ticking. I hung up. Ryan called that night. I almost didn't answer, but I wanted to hear what he had to say for himself. He opened with this casual thing about how crazy things had gotten, like we were buddies catching up. I stayed silent. He kept talking, explaining how the business failure wasn't really his fault, how the market had shifted, how his suppliers had screwed him over, how the landlords were being unreasonable. Everything was someone else's fault, according to him. Then he got to the point, said he knew I was doing well for myself, that he'd heard I was pulling in serious money, said what happened to his business could happen to anyone, and I shouldn't hold it against him, that we were brothers and brothers helped each other out. I asked him if he remembered calling me a loser. He laughed, actually laughed, and said that was just family stuff, that he was joking around. I asked if he was joking when he said maybe in my next life I wouldn't be such a failure. He got defensive and said I was being too sensitive, that he'd been riding high on his success and maybe got a little cocky, but that was years ago. I asked about the inheritance money. Ryan said that money went to a good cause, that he'd been trying to build something real and it just didn't work out. That if I wanted to be petty about money from years ago when our parents were about to be homeless, That said more about me than him. The conversation went on for almost an hour. Ryan kept trying to downplay everything they'd done to me while emphasizing how dire their situation was now. He mentioned Georgia being stressed to the point of making herself sick, my nieces crying about having to change schools if they lost the house, my parents not sleeping because they were so worried. He laid it on thick. At one point, he said something that really stuck with me. He said that holding grudges was easy, but being the bigger person was hard, and this was my chance to show everyone what kind of man I really was. That I could either prove I was the petty loser they'd always thought I was, or I could step up and be the hero the family needed right now. I told him I'd get back to him and ended the call. He texted me 10 minutes later saying he hoped I'd do the right thing. I've been sitting with all this information for 2 days now, reading through all your comments on my last post, getting perspective, thinking through my options. Here's what I know. They're desperate, they're panicking, and they see me as their only lifeline. They've admitted they were wrong, but only because they need something from me. They're sorry, but only because their golden child destroyed them and now they're facing consequences. And here's what they don't know. I've been preparing for something like this for years. Not this exact scenario, but for the moment when they'd finally need me, and I'd have the power to help or not help. I built my career, my savings, my entire financial position specifically, so that when this moment came, I'd be the one in control. The question isn't whether I can help them. I absolutely can. I have the money to pay off that foreclosure notice and barely feel it. The question is whether I will help them, and what price I'm going to exact if I do. Because here's what some of you said in the comments that really resonated. This isn't just about revenge. This is about making sure they understand, really understand, what they did to me and what they lost by choosing Ryan over me for 10 years. This is about making them feel every bit of the dismissal and disappointment they made me feel, but with stakes that actually matter. I'm meeting with all of them this Friday at my parents' house. My idea, my terms, my timeline. I told them I'd hear everyone out in person and then make my decision about whether I'm willing to help. They all agreed immediately, grateful that I was even considering it. They think I'm coming to decide if I'll save them. They're wrong. I'm coming to show them exactly what 10 years of being the family disappointment has turned me into. And trust me, they're not going to like it. Update 2. The meeting was yesterday and I'm still processing everything that went down. Some of you said I should bring a witness or record it, but I wanted this to be just family so they couldn't claim I was trying to humiliate them publicly. This needed to be private so they'd say what they really meant without worrying about outsiders judging them. I showed up at my parents' house at 2 p.m. like we'd agreed. The driveway had 3 cars in it. My parents' aging sedan and 2 others I didn't recognize at first. Turns out Ryan had to sell both his luxury vehicles. He's driving a rental now, and Georgia has some older SUV they bought cheap off a lot. The house itself looked worse than I remembered. Paint peeling on the shutters, lawn overgrown, one of the gutters hanging loose. They'd clearly stopped maintaining anything months ago when the money dried up. My mother answered the door and immediately tried to hug me. I stepped back and walked past her into the living room. Everyone was already there, waiting. My father sitting in his usual armchair looking about 10 years older than the last time I'd seen him. Ryan on the couch next to Georgia, both of them looking tense. My nieces weren't there. They'd apparently been sent to a neighbor's house for this conversation. The room went quiet when I sat down in the chair across from all of them. My mother perched on the arm of my father's chair. Nobody knew how to start, so I did. I asked them to walk me through the complete financial situation. Every debt, every obligation, everything they owed, and to whom. My father pulled out a folder he'd obviously prepared, started going through papers, explaining each debt in detail, the second mortgage, the co-signed leases, personal loans they'd taken out to help Ryan keep the businesses running, credit card debt they'd racked up covering Ryan's payroll when cash flow dried up. The numbers were actually worse than he'd told me on the phone. They weren't just facing foreclosure on the house. They had creditors coming after them for close to $270,000 total. Ryan kept interrupting to add context, explaining why each loan had made sense at the time, how he'd had solid projections showing the expansion would work, how the market shifted unexpectedly. My father let him talk. My mother kept nodding along like Ryan's excuses mattered. I asked Ryan directly how much of my inheritance money was left. He blinked at me and said it was all gone, spent on the business expansion. I asked what they got in return for $180,000. He started explaining about commercial build-outs and initial inventory and security deposits. I cut him off and asked what assets existed now that could be liquidated. He admitted there was nothing. Everything had been sold off or repossessed. Georgia jumped in and said they'd lost everything too, that Ryan had worked himself to exhaustion trying to save the businesses, that it wasn't fair to act like he'd been reckless when he'd been trying to build something for the family. I asked her if she remembered calling me a poor thing with no ambition. She looked away. My father tried to redirect the conversation to solutions, asked what I'd need to see from them to consider helping, whether there were terms we could agree on. I told them I'd been thinking about this a lot over the past week and I had some questions first that I needed answered honestly. I asked my mother why she thought Ryan deserved my inheritance more than I did. She got flustered and said she'd already apologized for that she'd been wrong. I told her that wasn't what I asked. I asked what specifically about Ryan made her think he deserved that money while I didn't. She stammered something about Ryan having a proven track record, about the business showing promise, about wanting to support entrepreneurship. I asked if she'd ever once asked me about my career, about what I was doing, about what my goals were. She said she had, but I knew she was lying. I asked her to tell me what my job title was. She couldn't. My father tried to intervene and said this wasn't productive, that dwelling on past mistakes wouldn't solve their current crisis. I told him we were absolutely going to dwell on it because I needed them to understand exactly what they'd done before I made any decisions about helping. I turned to Ryan and asked him why he thought it was okay to call me a loser to my face. He did that thing where he tried to laugh it off again, said it was just brother stuff and I was taking it too seriously. I asked him if he'd like me to call him a failure right now, to tell him he'd destroyed our parents' lives through incompetence and arrogance. His expression changed immediately. He said that was different, that his business failure was a legitimate attempt that didn't work out while I'd just been coasting with a regular job. That's when I told them my actual income, the number I'd made last year from my salary plus consulting. The room went completely silent. My father asked me to repeat it. I did. Ryan's face went through about 5 different expressions in 3 seconds. Georgia said something about how if I had that kind of money, then helping them should be easy. I asked her why she assumed I'd want to help people who'd spent a decade treating me like I was worthless. She said family was supposed to help family, and I was being cruel by holding the past over their heads when they were in crisis. I told them I'd come prepared with a proposal. If they wanted my help, it would come with conditions, non-negotiable conditions that they'd all have to agree to. First condition, Ryan would publicly acknowledge to the entire extended family that he'd destroyed our parents' financial security through his failed business decisions. Not market conditions, not bad luck, his decisions. He'd have to own it completely in front of everyone. Second condition, my parents would sign a legal document acknowledging they owed me $180,000 plus interest from the date they gave that money to Ryan, and that any financial help I provided now would be credited against that debt, not a gift. Third condition, Ryan and Georgia would move out of my parents' house within 2 weeks, regardless of what happened with the foreclosure situation. Fourth condition, my parents would attend family counseling with me for a minimum of 6 months to address how they'd treated me. Ryan exploded, started yelling about how I was trying to humiliate him, how I was using their crisis to settle scores, how I was being vindictive and petty. He said there was no way he'd debase himself in front of the whole family just to get my help, that he'd rather they lose the house than submit to that. My mother started crying and begging Ryan to calm down. My father told him to let me finish. Ryan stood up and said he didn't need to hear this garbage. Georgia told him to sit back down. He refused. She grabbed his arm and hissed something at him about thinking about their daughters. He sat back down, but he was furious. I continued. Fifth condition, they would never again compare me to Ryan in any context. Never suggest he was more successful, more ambitious, more anything. That narrative was over. My father asked if I was seriously demanding they attend counseling like they were children. I told him yes, that they'd damaged me with their treatment for years, and if they wanted my money, they'd have to face what they'd done. He said that felt like manipulation. I asked him if giving my inheritance to Ryan without my input wasn't manipulation. My mother asked how much money I was willing to provide. I told her that depended on whether they accepted all the conditions. She asked what would happen if they didn't accept. I told her I'd leave, and they'd never hear from me again about this situation. Ryan called me a spiteful jerk, said I was enjoying watching them squirm, that I'd probably been waiting years for a chance to lord my success over them. I told him he was absolutely right, that I'd spent years building my career specifically so that when this moment came, I'd have the power and they wouldn't. Georgia started arguing that my conditions were designed to be humiliating rather than helpful, that if I really wanted to help family, I'd just help without demanding they prostrate themselves first. I asked her if she'd help someone who'd treated her the way they'd treated me. She said that was different. My father asked if we could negotiate the terms. I told him no. These were the conditions, all of them, or I walked. He said I was being unreasonable and that family didn't treat each other this way. I reminded him that they'd treated me exactly this way for a decade, and apparently that had been fine. The argument went in circles for over an hour. Ryan kept trying to negotiate down the first condition, saying he'd acknowledge some responsibility but not complete responsibility. I told him that wasn't how this worked. My mother kept trying to appeal to my sense of compassion, saying they were desperate, and didn't I care about them at all? I told her I cared about them exactly as much as they'd cared about me when they gave away my inheritance. Eventually, my father said they needed time to discuss it privately as a family. I told him they had 72 hours to give me a yes or no to all conditions. If I didn't hear from them by Monday at 5 p.m., the offer was off the table permanently. Ryan said I was bluffing, that I wouldn't actually let them lose their house. I stood up and told him to try me. I told all of them they'd had years to treat me with basic respect, and they'd chosen not to. They'd had years to support me even minimally, and they'd chosen to give everything to Ryan instead. Now they were facing consequences for those choices, and I was offering them one chance to fix it on my terms. My mother grabbed my arm as I headed for the door and begged me to reconsider, to show mercy, to remember that mistakes didn't define people. I told her that for 10 years she'd let her mistakes define me, and now I was just returning the favor. I left them there, arguing with each other. Got in my car and drove away while my phone started blowing up with texts from all of them. Ryan saying I was destroying the family, my mother pleading with me to be reasonable, my father saying we needed to find a compromise. I haven't responded to any of them. It's been 18 hours since that meeting and they're panicking. My phone has 63 unread messages. Georgia sent me a long message about how I'm traumatizing my nieces by putting them through this uncertainty. Ryan sent one saying I'd regret making an enemy of him. My mother sent one every hour asking if we could talk. The deadline is Monday at 5 p.m. I don't know if they'll accept my conditions or if they'll refuse out of pride and lose everything. Part of me wants them to refuse so I can watch Ryan's arrogance cost them their house. Part of me wants them to accept so I can watch them eat crow in front of everyone who watched them worship him for years. Either way, I win. Either they submit to my conditions and finally acknowledge what they did to me, or they refuse and prove they'd rather lose everything than admit they were wrong about me. Both outcomes show everyone who the real failure in this family was all along. I'm not backing down on a single condition. Monday at 5 p.m., I get my answer. Final update. Monday came and went. They missed my deadline by 6 hours and 43 minutes, which told me everything I needed to know about how seriously they took my conditions. My father finally called at 11:43 p.m., claiming they'd been trying to reach a family consensus all day and needed just a bit more time. I told him the deadline had passed and hung up. The messages that followed were frantic. My mother sent 17 texts in 20 minutes, begging me to reconsider, saying they were ready to accept everything, that I couldn't just abandon them over 6 hours. Ryan sent a message saying I was being ridiculous about arbitrary timelines when real people's lives were at stake. Georgia sent one asking if I enjoyed torturing them. I didn't respond to any of it. I'd been clear about the deadline and they'd chosen to ignore it. That decision had consequences. What they didn't know was that I'd already made moves regardless of whether they accepted my conditions or not. See, while they were spending the weekend arguing about which of my demands they could stomach, I was spending the weekend executing the plan I'd been building for years. Because here's what a lot of you figured out in the comments. This was never really about whether they'd accept my help. This was about watching them realize exactly what they'd lost when they chose Ryan over me. Tuesday morning, I got a call from my father at 6 a.m. He was at the bank. Apparently overnight, someone had paid off the $47,000 foreclosure notice. The house was no longer in immediate danger. He wanted to know if it was me. I told him to check who made the payment. He said the bank wouldn't tell him, just that the debt had been satisfied by a third party and the foreclosure was canceled. My mother called an hour later crying, saying she didn't understand what was happening, but thank God someone had helped them. She asked again if it was me. I asked her why she'd assume I'd help after they'd missed my deadline. She said maybe I'd had a change of heart, maybe I'd realized family was more important than pride. I let them sit with that confusion for 3 days. Let them wonder who'd saved their house. Let them question whether I'd secretly decided to help them after all, despite my ultimatum. The texts kept coming asking if we could talk, asking what happened, asking if I knew anything about the payment. Friday afternoon, I called my father and told him we needed to meet. Same place, same setup as before. Everyone present. He agreed immediately, probably thinking I was going to admit I'd paid off the foreclosure and we could move forward. I showed up Saturday at noon. Everyone was there again, including Ryan and Georgia. The atmosphere was different this time. Less desperate, more confused. They actually looked hopeful, like maybe this meeting would end with some kind of reconciliation. I sat down, and my father started thanking me for saving the house. I told him to stop. He looked confused. I told him I didn't pay off the foreclosure. The hope drained from his face. My mother asked who did then. I told them I had no idea, but it wasn't me. Ryan said that was convenient timing, that it had to be me. I pulled out my phone and showed them my bank statements from the past week. No $47,000 withdrawal, no wire transfers, nothing. I hadn't touched my money. Someone else had paid their debt. The room went silent while they processed this. Then my father asked why I'd called this meeting if I hadn't helped them. I told him I called it to explain what was actually going to happen now. I reminded them they'd missed my deadline. The offer I'd made was officially off the table, but their situation had given me a lot of time to think about what they really deserved after a decade of treating me like garbage. So I'd done some research into their financial situation beyond what they'd told me. My father's expression changed. He told me I had no right to dig into their private finances. I told him that when you're facing foreclosure and multiple lawsuits, your finances aren't that private. Court documents are public record. Loan documents get filed with the county. It's amazing what you can find when you actually look. I'd found out that my parents had co-signed on 4 different loans for Ryan, not 2 like they'd told me. They'd also guaranteed a business line of credit that Ryan had maxed out right before everything collapsed. The total debt they were facing was actually closer to $340,000, not the $270,000 they'd claimed. My mother started to protest, but I kept talking. I'd also found out that Ryan hadn't actually filed for bankruptcy yet. He'd told them he had to make them feel better about their situation, but the paperwork showed he'd only filed the initial petition. He was still in the process, which meant creditors could still come after him if they moved fast enough. Ryan's face went red. He said I had no business looking into his bankruptcy filing. I told him it was public record, same as everything else. Georgia demanded to know what I was getting at with all this. Here's what I was getting at. Someone had paid off their foreclosure, but that was just one debt. They still owed over $290,000 to various creditors who were absolutely going to pursue collection. The house was safe for now, but they were still drowning, and I'd spent the past week reaching out to every single one of those creditors. My father asked what I meant by reaching out. I explained that I'd contacted each company Ryan owed money to and informed them that Ryan had lied about filing bankruptcy, that his petition wasn't complete, and that he still had assets that could be seized if they acted quickly. I'd also helpfully provided them with information about the timeline of his business collapse and the suspicious transfers he'd made right before closing the stores. Ryan jumped up and started yelling about how I'd sabotaged him, how I'd set creditors on him when he was already down. I told him I'd simply corrected some misinformation he'd been spreading. If he'd actually completed his bankruptcy filing like he'd told everyone, my calls wouldn't have mattered. Georgia was on her feet too, demanding to know what I thought I'd accomplished. I told her I'd accomplished exactly what I set out to do. I'd made sure Ryan would face consequences for destroying our parents' financial security. Those creditors were now highly motivated to collect from him personally before his bankruptcy went through. My mother asked how I could do this to my own brother. I asked her how she could give my inheritance to someone who clearly had no idea how to manage money. She said that was different, that they'd been trying to help him succeed. I told her they'd helped him fail spectacularly, and now everyone was paying the price. My father said I was being vindictive for the sake of it, that I wasn't helping anyone with this behavior. I told him he was wrong. I was helping myself. I was making sure they understood that choices have consequences, that you can't treat someone like trash for a decade and then expect them to save you when your golden child implodes. Ryan said I'd crossed a line, that what I'd done was sabotage and he could sue me for it. I told him to go ahead and try, that everything I'd told those creditors was factually accurate and documented in public records. He had no case. Then I got to the real point of this meeting. I told them I'd made a decision about their financial situation. I wasn't going to help them directly, but I'd arranged something else. I'd contacted 3 different financial counseling services and set up appointments for my parents to restructure their remaining debt. I'd prepaid for 6 months of their services. I'd also contacted a family lawyer who specialized in elder financial abuse and set them up with a consultation to discuss their options for recovering money from Ryan through civil court. My mother asked what I meant by financial abuse. I told her that when an adult child convinces their parents to co-sign loans and mortgage their house based on false projections and then files bankruptcy leaving them with all the debt, that's financial abuse. The lawyer could help them understand their options. Ryan started yelling that I was trying to turn our parents against him, that this was all about my ego and my need for revenge. I told him he was absolutely right about the revenge part. I'd spent years waiting for him to screw up badly enough that everyone would see what I'd always known, that he was incompetent, that he'd always been incompetent, and that our parents had wasted a decade and $180,000 of my inheritance supporting his incompetence. My father said I was being cruel and that this was going too far. I reminded him that he'd told me at least one of his sons had made something of himself, looking right at Ryan when he said it. I asked him if he still thought Ryan was that son. He didn't answer. I told him the financial counseling services would help them navigate the debt they actually had left. The house payment was covered, but everything else was their problem. They could work with the counselors to set up payment plans, possibly settle some debts for less than owed, and start rebuilding. It would take years, but it was possible. Georgia said this was all manipulation, that I was playing God with their lives. I told her that for 10 years they'd played God with mine, deciding I wasn't worth supporting or respecting, and now they were experiencing what it felt like to be on the other side of that equation. My mother asked why the house payment if I wasn't going to help them with anything else. I told her I didn't pay the house. She insisted it had to be me. I told her it genuinely wasn't, and I was as curious as they were about who did it. The conversation devolved into arguments and accusations. Ryan kept trying to find ways to blame me for his business failure. Georgia kept insisting I was obligated to help family in crisis. My parents kept oscillating between being grateful the house was saved and being angry I wouldn't do more. I let them argue for a while before I stood up to leave. My father asked what I expected to happen now, where we went from here as a family. I told him we didn't go anywhere as a family. They'd made their choices about what kind of family we were when they gave away my inheritance and spent a decade treating me like a failure. This was them living with those choices. Ryan said I was making a mistake, that someday I'd regret burning these bridges. I told him the bridges burned years ago when he called me a loser to my face and our parents laughed along. I was just making sure the ashes were scattered properly. My mother tried one more time to appeal to family loyalty, to the idea that we were supposed to love each other despite mistakes. I told her that ship had sailed around the same time she told me I didn't deserve my inheritance like Ryan did, that I'd learned from them that family loyalty was conditional on whether you were useful, and right now they weren't useful to me in any capacity. I walked out while they were still processing that, got in my car and drove away. My phone stayed silent for about an hour before the messages started. Angry ones from Ryan calling me every name he could think of, desperate ones from my mother begging me to reconsider, resigned ones from my father saying he hoped I could live with what I'd done. I can live with it just fine. Better than fine, actually. I spent 10 years building myself into someone successful specifically so I'd have the power when this moment came. And now that it's here, I'm using that power exactly how I always planned to. The creditors are already moving on Ryan. He called me 3 days after our meeting saying I'd destroyed him, that they were going after his rental car and George's SUV and anything else they could find before his bankruptcy finalized. I told him that was unfortunate and hung up. My parents are apparently going through with the financial counseling. My father sent me a stiff message thanking me for setting that up, while also making it clear they'd never forgive me for what I'd done to Ryan. I didn't respond. I still don't know who paid off their foreclosure. Got a theory it might have been one of my aunts who always liked my mother, but she's denying it. Whoever it was, they saved the house but didn't solve any of the other problems, which means my parents are still buried in debt, but at least have a roof over their heads. Ryan and Georgia are apparently looking for a cheap apartment somewhere, now that they have to move out. My parents finally agreed with my condition about them leaving, not because I demanded it, but because the tension in that house got unbearable once everyone realized how badly Ryan had screwed them all. So where does that leave everything? My parents kept their house but lost their retirement and their golden child's reputation. Ryan lost his business, his house, his cars, most of his assets, and his status as the family success story. Georgia lost the comfortable life she thought she'd married into. And I got exactly what I wanted, watching them all face consequences for a decade of treating me like I was worthless while worshiping at Ryan's altar. Some of you in the comments asked if I'd feel guilty eventually. I don't. You can't treat someone like garbage for years and then expect them to save you when your choices catch up to you. They made their bed with Ryan, and now they're lying in it while he files bankruptcy and takes them down with him. The family's fractured now, probably permanently. Extended family members have taken sides, mostly against me, which is fine. They weren't there for the decade of casual cruelty. They just see me refusing to help in a crisis. Let them think whatever they want. I built my success for this moment. 10 years of being called a failure while I worked harder than any of them ever did. 10 years of watching them hand everything to Ryan while acting like I didn't exist. And now, I'm the only one standing while they're all scrambling to figure out how to survive. That inheritance money they gave Ryan? Gone. That house they almost lost? Saved by someone else. That golden child they invested everything in? Bankrupt and being pursued by creditors because I made sure they knew he was still vulnerable. I won. They lost. And unlike them, I don't need to pretend this is about anything other than what it actually is. Revenge for 10 years of being treated like the family disappointment by people who couldn't recognize success if it bought them dinner. Which I did, once. Back in 2021, I took them to a nice restaurant to celebrate my promotion. Paid for everything. They spent the whole dinner talking about Ryan's business expansion and barely acknowledged I'd picked up a $400 tab. I remembered that dinner while I was calling Ryan's creditors. Remembered every dismissal, every comparison, every time they made it clear I'd never measure up to their favorite son. And I made sure those creditors had every piece of information they needed to collect what they were owed. Family's supposed to have your back. Mine spent a decade proving they only had Ryan's back. Now Ryan's back is against the wall, and they're all scrambling. And I'm sitting here with my successful career and my intact finances, watching them panic. This is what 10 years of being the family failure gets you. The power to watch them all fail while you succeed. And I'm going to enjoy every second of it.